Alex are here to take you with us into the journey of digital health. We would like to have an insider's view within the FDA regulations and guidances and requirements for the digital health. Um, I will have a short presentation of the logistics, then present GSAP, go through the agenda, and then have Alex to present MICRA, and have to present the webinar itself. So, Alex, can we move to the next slide, please? Okay, so for the frequently asked questions regarding the logistics, if you have some questions during the webinar, you can submit those to the Q&A session right on the upper side of your screen. And you can also put it into the chat. We will look at both of them and we'll answer those during the Q&A session in the end of the webinar. Everyone who are registered to this session will have the recording and the slides within few days following the webinar. So don't worry, you will have that, and you can contact us through that email that you will receive the webinar through. You can also contact GSAP and MICRA contact persons in the emails indicated here in the slide. You will also be contacted by GSAP representative within few days or within a week from this webinar. Next slide, please. So who we are at GSAP? GSAP is a company that provides services to the worlds of medical device, pharma, advanced therapeutics, medical cannabis, and food tech. And the company was founded at 2009 by Dr. Sigalita Arieli Portnoy, and now it is part of the Novolo Group. GSAP provides regulatory, quality, engineering, and validation and CRO services. We have very vast services that we are providing. We work with hundreds of companies, from startup to large companies and hospitals in Israel and around the world. And we have more than 70 experts within our company. The company's vision is to bring the highest quality and safest care to the patient in the shortest time. We have also the learning center named G-Study. This webinar is part of this center, and it also presents the collaboration that we're initiating with MICRA, and you will get to know MICRA within few minutes. Next slide, please. We were shocked. All the industry actually was shocked last week with the sudden death of our beloved Sigalit. It was really shocking, really sudden. She had many years of experience in the pharmaceutical industry. She founded GSAP. She was a CEO in several leading companies. And we have this webinar is also part of her legacy. And we are doing it in a loving memory for her, and it was important for us to highlight that and also to have our condolences to the family. Next slide, please. So for today presenters, I'm Ella. I'm US Medical Device Regulatory Manager in GSAP. I have more than 10 years of experience in the regulatory landscape worldwide. Especially my expertise are within the US FDA field. And I will be your moderator for today. Your presenter will be Dr. Alex Cadote from MICRA, and he will present himself within few minutes. Next slide, please. So what are we going to hear here today in the webinar agenda? We will have an introduction to MICRA, And then we will dive into regulatory topics such as clinical decision support, artificial intelligence and machine learning best practices, cybersecurity and software documentation, and of course, a very interesting issue of predetermined change control plan, which we have a lot of questions and topics to discuss on. And then the webinar will end in 15 minutes or more, if we will need, of Q&A session when we will answer your questions. So I will give now the way to Alex. Good luck, Alex. I'm here.
Thanks, Ella. So hi, everyone. My name is Alex Kadat. I'm the Vice President of Digital Health, AI, and Radiology Regulatory Affairs. I've been with MICRA for about 3 years. Prior to that, I was with the US FDA for about 6 years. I've been in industry, research, and regulatory for over 20 years. When I was at FDA, I worked on things like the predetermined change control guidance. I worked with digital health for a year, working on the pre-cert program, and basically had anywhere from minor to major contributions to a lot of digital health efforts at the agency. I was also part of the AI machine learning working group, and prior to FDA, I was in industry for a while in the neuroelectrophysiology device space. And prior to that, I was a researcher at the University of Florida studying epilepsy and autism, and I have a PhD in biomedical engineering and neuroscience. So MICRA is a global full-service CRO and integrated advisory firm. We support clients across multiple therapy areas. We operate and have locations in 3 countries, the United States, the EU, and Japan. MICRA prides itself on its team, which includes over 200 employees, 25 plus of whom are former FDA officials, all contributing to a 90% employee retention rate. Our core services are full service clinical support in the US, Europe, as well as Japan, regulatory, reimbursement, quality assurance, compliance, and cybersecurity. I will be talking a little bit more later about the AI Imaging Center. So just getting into a little depth for my team with digital health, just highlighting that we have an ex-FDA statistician, Hava Zibman. Sam Engelman from my team is a veteran of industry and is also specialized in electrical testing. Dee Lu is a manager on our team. She specializes in usability engineering. Nidhi Ghani has joined us recently and is an expert on cybersecurity. And finally, just to introduce our AI and Imaging Center, the concept here is that for AI devices, whether it's for radiology or for other various digital health applications, that we provide regulatory strategy, help design your study, and if there's a need to collect cases from clinical sites, we set those up and collect those. We assess the data, truth the data, perform the standalone testing, and if necessary, an MR-MC study. And then towards the end, we do statistical analysis and provide study reports, which support your FDA submission. The general idea here is that you do the right study the first time. Nima Aklagi is our director of the AI and Imaging Center. He was at FDA, also working on various AI machine learning components and was often a consulting reviewer from the Office of Science and Engineering Laboratories. Jenny Treiber is a veteran of basically this type of study management. She's worked in this field for over 10 years. And she basically is responsible for the operations of the AI and Imaging Center. So with that and the introduction to MICRA complete, I'm going to move into our first topic, clinical decision support. So the important thing to understand about clinical decision support is that it's the result of Congress passing a law that basically excludes many different functions from the definition of a medical device. So just to point out here for my presentation, My presentation is focused more on what FDA's current thinking is regarding clinical decision support, which also includes FDA's interpretation of Section 201H and is also reflected in the September 2022 final guidance. So just to make a point up front here, the opposite of non-device CDS is not device CDS. It's basically that it's a medical device or a device function. Basically, computer-aided detection or diagnosis isn't necessarily clinical decision support. It's more important to realize that it's a medical device. And really, that's what clinical decision support guidance is intended to do, is help distinguish from those things that that Congress has excluded from the definition of a medical device. So getting into the language of the law, basically, the first criterion of 4 that was put forth is that in order for something to be considered clinical decision support, it's not intended to acquire, process, or analyze basically medical signals. The second criterion is is basically starting to talk about what the device is that's excluded from the definition. So these types of devices are intended for displaying, analyzing, or printing medical information about a patient or other medical information. And the interesting thing is that 2 and 3 and 4, it's not an or, it's and. So it's and intended for the purpose of supporting or providing recommendations. And the key word in this phrasing is about prevention, diagnosis, or treatment. If it was intended that this is for prevention, diagnosis, or treatment, and that about refers to the basically peer-reviewed clinical studies and clinical practice guidelines. They should be about prevention, diagnosis, and treatment about the disease. And then 4 basically states that it's not the intent of this software to make a clinical diagnosis or treatment decision regarding an individual patient. This includes aided devices. So basically, putting this all together in maybe more of a plain language explanation is you can use medical information to suggest articles and guidelines to doctors to read about prevention, diagnosis, and treatment. If it's that medical device, if that medical information doesn't include inputs from a diagnostic medical device. Also, don't claim providing those articles and guidelines is a diagnostic. They are basically not a diagnostic. If all these conditions are met, you're not a medical device. So there are some common misconceptions in this space. Some of the things that I've heard in discussions, both inside and outside the agency, is as long as I'm not providing a final diagnosis, I'm just clinical decision support. Well, that's true of a lot of medical devices. They don't necessarily provide a final diagnosis, but they are still considered a medical device. So saying that you're clinical decision support and basically not a medical device in that case would not be true. Other things that we often hear is it's just low-risk software that aids the doctor. They can override the decision. That's true about 99% of the software FDA has cleared, both in the AI and algorithmic space. They aid the clinician as opposed to being the sole source of information for making a clinical decision. Also, the diagnostic output only supports clinical decision making. Well, that might be a clever rearrangement of the name of these, but it's not, it actually changes the meaning of the words when you talk about it that way. So clinical decision support is a very specific carve out from the law that basically determines what's a device and what's not a device. Just an excerpt from a recent slideshow from FDA basically backs up this plain language definition, and it basically walks through those four criterion in a similar way than as I just discussed. And I've provided the link here if you wanted to explore this further. There's a lot more information on this page that talks about clinical decision support. So just some quick examples here. One example that was very controversial in this space was this idea of sepsis detection. Based on a lot of the articles that were out there, it seems that these devices often pull data and other factors from the ER to assess sepsis risk. And this was rather controversial because I don't think FDA necessarily agreed. And some of the evidence there that this type of function is considered a medical device is now that there are medical devices that have been granted through the de novo process. For example, Prognosis with de novo 230036. And this basically cements the idea of FDA's oversight here. So if you consider the clinical decision support criterion, basically the software models appear to include inputs from the EMR. So you may pass criterion 1 here. However, when I was investigating a lot of the devices that are on the market, it was kind of unclear from some of the publications whether these devices were just providing information for the EMR or if that information from the EMR was actually an output from a medical device. Just because the output from a medical device is in the EMR doesn't give it any special status. So if you are inputting basically outputs from other medical devices into your clinical decision support software, this would fail criterion 1. Also, criterion 2 would be failed is because the software identifies patients and it provides a risk score. It's not providing information, and it's not providing information from guidelines or materials related to diagnosis of sepsis because it's identifying a risk for an individual patient. So that would fail criterion 2. The software does not output information about sepsis. It outputs a risk score for sepsis. So 2 and 3 are a little bit intertwined, but I think it's pretty clear that you'd also fail criterion 3. The output is intended to be an aid in diagnosis. It's basically sending a warning to a clinician that a patient may be at risk for sepsis. And in this case, it also fails criterion 4 because criterion 4 basically says that that the output from the device would be considered a diagnostic. I think an important thing to understand here is that FDA considers diagnostic not only to mean diagnosis, it can be a wide range of things that are of diagnostic quality that basically a clinician would rely on for making a decision. So another example that I've kind of fabricated here, just to kind of make the point of what is clinical decision support and what is not, um, I've made up this idea of a thyroid cancer screening helper, which um, basically looks at a predetermined list of risk factors in a patient's medical record, uh, basically not including any outputs from medical devices. And this includes IVDs and other types of devices that may be used as an input to this particular software. Basically, these predetermined combination of risk factors are identified from the EMR kind of in a binary fashion for each one. They're identified and put forward, and basically highlights how this information exists in the patient record and provides thyroid cancer screening guidelines, basically from professional societies, professional clinical societies, with the intended risk factors collected from the EMR. So going through the CDS questions, the software searches these 37 distinct inputs from the patients from the EMR that do not include any outputs from medical devices. So pass criterion 1. Criterion 2, the software identifies medical information related to those risk factors for those 37 findings from the EMR and gathers it into one place. So you're passing criterion 2. And the software transparently aggregates these risk factors and provides ACR's guidelines on a range of research articles for consumption by the physician. The device outputs do not include any scores, ratings, triage considerations, categorizations, or conclusions for the individual patient. The only output are the articles that provide information about diagnosis related to those risk factors. Any decisions are left to the physician. So CCS helper is non-device CDS. So with that, I'm going to move on to the next topic in our webinar, which is good machine learning practice. We've seen a rise in the number of AI devices that's been rather exponential over the past 5 or 6 years. I was rather fortunate to be at the agency during this kind of rise of AI and participate in a lot of the early discussions. One of the things that FDA did, along with its international colleagues, is come up with this 10 guiding principles document uh, with their IMDRF peers to develop these guiding principles for AI machine learning development. So I'm not going to read through each one of these. However, I am going to focus on them more in a plain language kind of way for what these 10 guiding principles mean. Basically, you should include clinicians and users in your design teams that include managers, engineers, RA, QA, management. It's basically pointing to the first guiding principle. You need a multidisciplinary team, and you should be considering a range of viewpoints when you're developing an AI machine learning medical device. Two, simply put, you need to do a good job with your software documentation and cybersecurity for your medical device. Data should be also representative of the patient population. And for FDA, that specifically means the United States. That includes race, ethnicity, gender, and then when you get into specific disease populations and patient populations, you need to ensure that you have sufficient representation from those cohorts so that you understand basically the population well enough to claim that your device works for everyone. The fourth guiding principle is along the lines of training and validation are from separate sites, not from data split from the same sites. The idea here is that you're not training your device and testing it on the same information, because in such a test you'd basically never fail. So essentially, to eliminate bias in these types of devices, FDA wants to ensure that your training and validation data are separate, and especially your test data isn't set up in a way that it would just basically guarantee that you would pass. Also, truthing methods for any data that you're using should be basically truth by the best method available. This typically means that US board certified clinicians and doctors are the ones that are establishing the ground truth, and not technicians. Quite often, technicians are put forward as basically being more experienced at a particular task, but FDA typically defaults to this idea that the best truthing out there is going to come from expert physicians, US boardified physicians. Other guiding principles here is the model design should match the intended use. You shouldn't design the device one way and then just talk about it differently in your labeling. FDA does compare these, and it's a very important part of the review process. Generally speaking, for guiding principle number 7, aided devices are preferred. Uh, Essentially understanding how the device and its outputs and inputs relate to the human element in the medical device workflow. Testing data should be from the relevant use environment. If you're collecting data from a kind of contrived simulation of the workflow that you might be trying to put your device into, it may not be considered the best data for that particular application. So you need to pay close attention to the quality of the data that you're collecting. Another key principle for the guiding principles is being transparent to your users. This includes the training, how you develop the device, what the architecture is, and also being very explicit about what the test set included. This relates back to this representative of the US population and relevant subgroups from the patient population. So FDA does expect that you are transparent about the performance in those critical subgroups. Also, FDA suggests that you have a plan for post-market monitoring. This is an interesting topic that's starting to gain momentum and starting to be seen in more and more de novo submissions coming out of the agency. And generally speaking, it's just good to understand how your device is performing in the real world. So moving on from that, let's talk about some of the fatal GMLP mistakes that I've seen when it comes to FDA submission. Oftentimes there's a desire for basically over-reliance on out-of-US data. Basically, there's not a guidance that says this, but typically the minimum threshold FDA will put forward is 50% OUS data. They will often say that you can provide justification for providing less data than that. However, just in practice, I've rarely seen that accepted. I've definitely seen cases where the justification and the less data is provided, and FDA basically just doesn't agree with the justification, and then the company has to go back and collect data from the United States. Related to guiding principle 3, not collecting a diverse data set that has race, ethnicity, gender information to do subgroup analysis. FDA has a center priority for, or CDRH, I should say, has a center priority for advancing health equity. You can't really talk about health equity if you don't have the information in your data set about race, ethnicity, and gender. So FDA does expect that you're paying attention to this and including this in your analysis for particular devices. A lot of times companies will put forward this idea that, well, this doesn't matter for these particular factors. And FDA will say, basically, because of your testing, there's uncertainty whether your device performs for everyone. And that is a reason that FDA will deny your pre-market submission. Not collecting test data from separate sites. This is something where FDA has been getting more and more stringent over the years, basically to ensure that there's not bias between your test set and your training data set. This includes making sure that your validation or essentially your test data is collected from separate sites than where you collected your training data. Another common mistake that we see is doing truthing with technicians who, in reality may be the ones more often doing this task. However, FDA insists based on the guiding principles that your ground truth be the best available. It's unlikely FDA will accept your justification for using technicians and will default primarily to US board certified clinicians, either overseeing or performing the tasks as part of your truthing. Sometimes what we've also seen is a training and validation mismatch where a device will be designed for a specific disease, but then the labeling says that it's only looking for findings. That is something that FDA does pay close attention to because there are different regulations that govern essentially detection and diagnosis of disease states versus general findings. Claiming your device only helps clinicians and doesn't provide a final diagnosis. As I mentioned earlier, this is about 99% of the devices on the market, kind of in this space. There are a few exceptions that FDA has granted a de novo for and subsequent 510Ks, pretty much in the eye space, looking at, I believe it's macular degeneration with the IDXDR device. However, that's pretty much a very unique category of device, and generally speaking, 99% of these devices are aided devices. So that's not necessarily a mitigation, it's an expectation from FDA. Another common mistake that we see is claiming your device input is generalizable to other manufacturers. For example, if your device inputs x-rays from an x-ray system and you only tested it on one model from one manufacturer, FDA will basically offer you the ability to narrow your indications for use potentially to that one scanner from that one manufacturer if you don't demonstrate generalizability. So that's also an important subgroup consideration for your data set, is to make sure that you've considered the range of inputs that you are going to claim that your device works with. And generally speaking, the other thing that we notice is just not thoughtfully addressing the US patient population. If you're just collecting cases and not looking at relevant confounders and kind of subgroups within that patient population, FDA will identify these groups in the review and ask for subgroup analyses. Often the common issue that can be challenging here is just basically not having collected that data as part of your data collection. And then you have to go back and either get those labels from the institutions that you collected the data from, or collect new data that has those labels. So just to kind of summarize here, and I really want to get the attention of any CEOs, investors, or leadership from medical device companies. A common scenario that we run into that I kind of made an example for here is having a medical executive at a top 10 medical device company decides that in order to run a lean study and run the study entirely outside the United States, use in-house technicians for truthing, and basically gathering all cases for training and tests from the same 3 sites that they collected their training data and also now their validation data. What the result is going to be. So I understand the motivation here is to run a lean study and keep costs down and, get this device into FDA very quickly for review so that you can get it on the market. But basically what ends up happening in this scenario is that FDA is going to issue deficiencies for basically the data in the study isn't representative of the US population because there's no US data in the study. The truthing method, another deficiency is that the truthing method doesn't use the best available ground truthing. Essentially, the technicians are not acceptable from FDA's perspective. So oftentimes you have to go back and redo the truthing. And this is often one of the more expensive pieces of these types of studies in our experience. And then also the testing is biased because the training and test data are collected from the same sites. And FDA is basically going to tell you, go gather different data that's independent from your training set. And basically what this often results in is that, your device team and your regulatory team may not be able to overcome all of these considerations within the typical hold period of 180 days. And essentially you either have to withdraw or potentially accept an NSE decision from the agency. So basically that decision to cut costs and try to convince FDA that these things are acceptable for the US market results in not saving money because you have to basically redo all of your clinical data collection. And it may be kind of a long, drawn out process. You may include some meetings there to try to convince FDA what you're doing is okay. And the end result is that the product is delayed to the market by several years, quite often. So I just really want to point out here to key decision makers, this is not a good strategy for getting your medical device on the market. And essentially, what you want to be thinking about with these good machine learning practices are the things that you need to do to make sure that when your study goes to the agency, it's right the first time. So I'm going to briefly switch gears to cybersecurity and software. I'm really only going to cover these at a very high level, but these are some of the things that cause the most deficiencies that we've witnessed for both of these topics. For cybersecurity, as many of you well know, the environment has changed dramatically in 2023. There had been kind of a gradual change from the agency over the past 5 to 6 years, but just to be clear at this point in time with 2023 and going forward, cybersecurity is your responsibility. It's not the hospitals, it's not the users, it's not something that you can just explain away in your user manual. The other common mistake we see is if your device contains any software or any firmware, you're not going to be able to explain your way about why you don't need to do these things. It doesn't matter what the risk profile of your device is. FDA expects this cybersecurity documentation if your device has software and firmware, no exceptions, no justifications. The eStar template has basically been designed to make it so that you cannot submit to FDA unless you have provided this information. We do not recommend kind of gaming the system and saying and answering the questions in the eStar to try to make the point that this doesn't apply to your device, because essentially your submission is going to be rejected for review and basically means you'll be getting it back in about 15 days without substantive review. The other problem with doing this is you're basically going into FDA and admitting you haven't done cybersecurity work. So that basically means you're doing a post-mortem on your device. And FDA knows that basically you're doing all your cybersecurity work now. So they're going to pay a lot closer attention to things, knowing that you didn't do a good job with your cybersecurity in the first place. And also, if you do manage to skate by and get into the review process but haven't done a great job with cybersecurity, I think it's pretty well known FDA has about 20 template deficiencies that basically they just have to click a checkbox and it appears in your list of deficiencies. I think a lot of manufacturers are kind of familiar with this idea that they get their AINN letter back from either their 510K de novo or PMA, and maybe about a third to a half of their deficiencies come back are cybersecurity deficiencies, simply because they're so easy for FDA to put in there. And they are consistent across the center with this approach. And these deficiencies have multiple subparts, and FDA doesn't necessarily go in and figure out each individual subpart it applies to. That's often left to you. At recent conferences, FDA cybersecurity staff has commented that industry generally is not doing a great job with cybersecurity, and FDA tends to get tougher. So the bottom line here is be prepared, do the work up front. It's going to be a lot harder if you wait and find out once you've submitted your 510K de novo or PMA to the agency. So when it comes to software, software has also evolved in 2023. Yes, I know there's quite a few differences in the software guidance. Some things have been kind of simplified, others have been kind of emphasized. And a lot of the things that seem new to the new software guidance are actually clarifications for things that FDA expected all along. From my perspective, what FDA put out in 2023 is a really great simplification of the previous process. Previously, minor, moderate, and major were the levels of concern. That's been simplified to basic and enhanced. The key differences there between basic and enhanced is basically basic doesn't require you getting into essentially the software design specification and like the specifics of design, whereas enhanced requires you to provide more of that information from your design history file. As I mentioned, a lot of people see new requirements, but actually a lot of them were there all along, and FDA is just doing a better job of clarifying what's in and what's expected. Um, One of the things that is often a misconception is that the software guidance tells you how well to document things in your design history file. That's actually never been true, and FDA made sure it was clear this time with the software guidance. What we consider, what FDA considers the enhanced level of documentation is expected to be in your design history file for all medical devices. This basically means that even though FDA may only ask for basic level of documentation, they expect there to be an enhanced level of documentation behind the scenes as part of your design history file, as part of your quality system. So if for some reason they ask you for enhanced documentation rather than basic, the expectation there is that it's pretty easy for you to provide because you were basically documenting it properly. Um, the other area where FDA has put a lot more emphasis is the risk management file. Previously, it was just the hazard analysis. Now it's the full risk management file that you might have as part of your design history. And really, this is the whole point of including software documentation for these devices, is essentially because FDA wants to understand how you're mitigating risks related to software as part of your implementation. And the riskier the device is, the more likely it is that that software design plays an important part in safety and effectiveness. And probably the third major area you may notice from the new guidance that wasn't done previously is now cybersecurity is very much interwoven into the software documentation because they go hand in hand. As I mentioned earlier, if you have software, you're going to be providing cybersecurity documentation to FDA. And that does include firmware for hardware only devices. Another thing just to be considering here that's often a major point is the FDA does compare your software architecture to your cybersecurity architecture. There may be subtle differences between these two things, but it doesn't necessarily mean that everything that appears in your cybersecurity architecture is part of your medical device. But FDA does need to understand how your medical device is interacting with other systems and how it's interoperable potentially with other medical devices and systems and basically the outside world. So generally speaking, those are the high-level considerations for software and cybersecurity that I wanted to talk about. So for my final topic, I wanted to talk about predetermined change control plans. So this is also another area where Congress passed a law. I certainly don't want to leave out the fact that FDA did a lot of work here with white papers, meetings, and various other things, including draft guidance development before this law was passed. Basically, what this law determined is that the predetermined change control plan allows you to make changes to your device as long as those changes have been essentially either cleared or approved as part of a pre-market submission. Now, one thing that's often controversial here is the way that Congress passed this law is that they did not make it AI machine learning specific, nor did they make it specific to any medical device. It basically was a change in the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act through this mechanism that essentially allows predetermined change control plans as part of pre-market submissions. It basically provides FDA with the authority to clear a device with a PCCP or whether that's a 510K, PMA, or various other submission types. Um, and then also, this part of the law also talked about some of the things that should be included in the plan. When it comes to the guidance, the guidance provides a little bit better walkthrough of kind of what's expected for a PCCP. Probably one of the most important things here is that you identify that there is a PCCP in your submission. I will tell you that if it's hidden deep within your submission and FDA doesn't review it, it's not cleared. And if FDA discovers it later, you might get a phone call from them and ask why it wasn't identified. The guidance makes it clear where you are supposed to include this documentation in your submission. And I definitely suggest that you follow that draft guidance for those considerations. An important note here, PCCP is basically allowable by law. And even though the FDA's guidance is draft, it basically still means that PCCPs are allowed as part of your submissions. So just basically saying that the law overrides, is a much higher on the totem pole than a guidance. Again, PCCP is still an optional mechanism, and they can be authorized for a variety of submissions. Also, the PCCP is a concept that's intended to harmonize with existing guidances that are out there about changes. To be clear, if those guidances already say that this is a function that you don't need to come in for FDA, you don't need to include those functionalities in a PCCP in order to do those things. So those guidances still apply, and the PCCP is typically expected to be a special carve out for something that you normally wouldn't expect to be able to not have to come in to FDA with an additional submission. So essentially, this is a very specific carve out in this space, allowing you to make modifications to your device that you've pre-specified and FDA has authorized that you are not only allowed to make those specific changes, but you have the proper kind of quality system and procedural machinery in place to carry out those changes. So as I mentioned before, the PCCP is a regulatory framework that allows these changes that normally would require 510K. This is often seen as a time savings for FDA review staff. And it also allows you to, with that predetermined change control plan, evolve your device in a controlled fashion. However, there are trade-offs. Some of those trade-offs basically are that you wouldn't necessarily want to do a PCCP for like one change that would require a very basic 510K to come back to FDA. So you really should be weighing kind of the essentially whether the juice is worth the squeeze, as some of my ex-FDA colleagues would say, between putting forward this PCCP that's often a lot more rigorous than most people expect. A lot of times for a complex PCCP, that section of your submission can be just as complex as the entirety of the rest of your submission. So once you've figured out that this is something that works for you and for the path that you'd like to take, there's a lot of questions out there of how PCCPs can be leveraged. They can be used, obviously, per this draft guidance to improve the performance of algorithms over time. Also from the guidance, things like calibration and modifications of cleared algorithms, possibly to fit a wider range of patients and adapt to needs of the patients as they come along, as long as those needs have been pre-specified. Adding new outputs from a device. Now, I want to be really clear here that this might be applicable from a consumer electronics standpoint, adding functionality to certain devices. However, any new outputs that you have can't change the intended use of the overall device. So it's really outputs potentially of the same type. If your outputs on like a Android tablet and you want to move it to an iOS tablet, that's what I mean by having different types of consumer electronic devices involved with the outputs of your devices. Also, device functions, basically well, we might have cleared it on Android, and in the future we want to clear it on iOS. That may be a good mechanism to use PCCP, kind of relative to software. And also making plan modifications to hardware that may involve just turning on new systems, for example, Wi-Fi once your device is ready to start working with the outside world. And basically, it may give you kind of a sequential way of keeping the system state of the art and making sure that your system has the ability to remain within a reasonable assurance of cybersecurity. These are areas that not necessarily have been all explored, but are potential possibilities for the use of PCCP. Kind of outside the AI machine learning and software space, some of the ideas here is PCCPs can be used to enable meaningful post-market monitoring. Post-market monitoring is now a big topic and often considered a risk mitigation for many devices. Using a PCCP, you can actually tie in mechanisms to close the loop and make modifications to your device when you find problems with your device in the post-market. Some other ideas for PCCP might be things like biocompatibility testing for low risk devices. One example would be ultrasound, where often, minor changes in the composition of a probe could be accommodated with a PCCP as long as you have the right procedures and processes available to basically come to those conclusions and set reasonable thresholds for that biocompatibility testing passing. Also, one of the ideas that we've had, we haven't seen necessarily implemented yet, but with these post-market monitoring activities, this may be a better way to ensure health equity, to make sure that not just from a potentially small data set that your device is being used in the pre-market, if you're able to monitor the performance in the post-market and modify your labeling, this would be a much better way to keep track of whether these devices are actually working for all Americans. Also, some other ideas here is, and one of these, some of the comments that I've heard at recent conferences from FDA staff is performance testing governed by standards is really ripe for PCCP, meaning that you could provide a proposal that you're going to basically follow those standards for your testing and have a very clear predetermined path for that testing, and you'd be able to modify those things without coming in for future updates to your device. And other ideas including expanding interoperability and compatibility with other medical devices. Just to end here, and this is my last slide for content, there's a lot of mistakes that are commonly made with PCCPs. I've kind of divided these in a couple different categories. Some overall considerations here is, did you actually identify the PCCP in your cover letter and the places where FDA asks you to in the draft guidance? Just need to be really clear here. If it's hidden within your submission and FDA doesn't review it and it's not in your 510(k) summary, it's not part of your medical device. Also, before you're ready to submit, is your PCCP roughly 10 pages or less? I'm not saying that that's always the case that it won't work, but generally speaking, that level of detail is usually insufficient, not only for predetermining what your changes are, but also for laying out all the processes and procedures that you would be following in detail for FDA to go over so that they have enough information to basically approve the PCCP as part of your submission. Also, a common mistake is not providing traceability, especially if you have multiple modifications that you're doing. And just like anything with an FDA submission, if FDA doesn't understand what you're doing, it's basically not gonna get past the review team. And then also, as I mentioned earlier, have you considered whether these are modifications you don't need a PCCP for? I mean, the software mods guidance and the modifications to 510(k) devices guidances list a wide range of things that you may not even need a PCCP for. So you should be considering these overall concerns before you submit. Finally, for kind of your modifications protocol, you need to be very specific about what the modifications are. As I mentioned, the current guidance that's out there is AI focused, but as I mentioned before, PCCP is not necessarily focused on just AI machine learning. How specific are the modifications protocol? It kind of goes hand in hand with that 10-page red flag that I talked about. Basically, if you have non-specific, open-ended, basically non-predetermined modifications without a plan, it's basically not going to go forward. Pre-specification is a key part of this, especially for your modifications in your protocol. And the FDA does expect things to be very specific. And in the end, that's kind of the next two questions that I have there are kind of in that same vein. As long as your PCCP oftentimes can rise to the same level of complexity as your overall 510(k) submission. So don't underestimate how much of a challenge it is sometimes to put these together. And finally, on the impact assessment side of things, really this translates to similar things that you're doing with your best benefit risk guidance. These changes that you're proposing, do they change the risk profile of your device? Do they change the intended use? These are things that you should be asking yourself as part of your own risk assessment for benefits as well as risks related to these changes that you're proposing. Also, it's really important that you provide a plan for updating your labeling. Do you have a plan for updating your labeling as part of your PCCP? That's one of the most important mitigations that FDA is going to be looking for coming out of basically your impact assessment. Kind of, I mentioned earlier, you should ask the question to yourself, is the intended use of my device conserved? FDA doesn't really allow you to change the indications for use for your device. So that is a static document. You don't actually get to add that. So don't make proposals where you would actually change or update your indications for use document as part of a PCCP. Also, the main thing here is do your changes introduce new risks? What are the mitigations that are needed? Some of those are engineering mitigations. Some of those are labeling mitigations. Make sure they're fully documented in your impact assessment as part of kind of your hazard analysis activities when you think about the future state of your device. So anyway, at a high level, these are common mistakes that I've seen with PCCPs, and hopefully this is helpful for you in understanding how PCCPs can be thoughtfully presented to FDA. So with that, I'm concluding kind of the educational part of the webinar and invite Ella to come back on and facilitate a question and answer session. And just as a recap here, we've covered clinical decision support, AI machine learning best practices, cybersecurity and software documentation, and predetermined change control plans.
Thank you, Alex. That was really interesting and very enlightening to hear all the important stuff that we usually only see when we're working on submissions and working with companies. I hope all the participants will take the keynotes from here and follow your suggestions. We have several questions here already waiting for us. So I will start with the question. I'm not sure the number of the slide is correct, but it states on slide 25, a minimum of 50% US data is for external validation study or for training, turning data sets as well. Are there different expectations for machine learning model training, tuning versus external validation datasets in general?
I would say here that most of FDA's emphasis is on that kind of final testing and validation data set. That 50% rule is specific to those data sets. But one of the things that we have seen in recent submissions with FDA, and one of their expectations for transparency, is that you are providing these breakdowns of where the data is coming from. And I have seen questions come from the agency before when a data set for training is completely outside the United States, especially when your validation results may not be very good. This may call into question about whether your device is actually trained and able to work on the target patient population. So I've seen those cases come back with questions from the agency, and I think that they are being a little bit more cognizant of those differences. But I've not yet seen a device necessarily NSE'd over kind of having a potentially 100% OUS data set for the training. That doesn't mean that it would never happen, but I think the main thing that I'm trying to emphasize here, about 80 to 90% of FDA's effort is going to be looking at that test and validation set very carefully. And likely, if that doesn't look very good, if your training for the device may give FDA some suspicion that it's not very well designed for the US market, then there may be some questions and concerns about your training data. But definitely FDA will expect you to be transparent, just as transparent about a lot of these factors for your training data set as they are for your final validation set.
Thank you, Alex. Additional questions from you is FDA expects, you have stated that FDA expects US board certified clinician to be the truthers. This is certainly true for external pivotal validation studies. Can the companies get by with a less rigorous truthing process for training, tuning data, meaning using expert technicians for truthing?
I think what you're asking there is, is there a requirement that all of the truthing activities being done by that US board certified clinician? There are cases where FDA has accepted situations where the tasks may be being done by, for example, a technician. I'm thinking particular maybe a segmentation device where the technicians may be doing the task, and then the output from that task is overseen by a panel of US board certified either radiologists or other clinicians. So in the end, they are the ones that are responsible for making final modifications to that, and either agreeing or disagreeing. And FDA also wants to account for the variability that you might see between different truthers as well. So that's often the case where you may be trying to save money by only having one US board certified clinician as part of your study. Usually the default in those cases is the 2+1 model, especially for radiology, where you have two, right, for example, radiologists looking at the ground truth, and if they disagree, you'd bring in perhaps a third more experienced radiologist to kind of serve as a tiebreaker. So those are pretty well-established procedures. Where often the mistake is only having the technicians be part of the process and claiming that they represent the best ground truth available. FDA has made it very clear that at a minimum, that oversight and correction from a US board certified clinician is necessary as part of that truthing process to make it the best ground truth available.
Thank you, Alex. Additional question we have is regarding the PCCP. So in practice, are PCCPs accepted and approved by FDA, or are they reluctant to approve them?
There's a lot of ifs and whens kind of as part of a question like that. Anytime you talk to FDA about a PCCP, what their preference is that you're kind of screening it with them prior to the submission. They'll always tell you to do a Q-sub prior to submitting it as part of your submission. Generally speaking, I would say that's a good practice because, as I mentioned earlier, PCCPs are optional. So you may put work into a PCCP, not go to FDA and talk about it in a pre-sub, and then basically it's part of your submission, and FDA writes, maybe 10, 15 deficiencies that you're not going to be able to overcome in your hold period for this because potentially you have deficiencies for other parts of your device as well. So a lot of times, answering that question, I have to kind of separate this idea of well-prepared PCCPs versus prepared PCCPs. I think when you've worked with FDA and you're going into your submission with something they've already seen and they've given you helpful advice on how to make sure that it works properly, what's possible, what's not possible, I think those have a much higher chance of being accepted. Whereas, if this is your first time adding a PCCP, it's very short, 2 or 3 pages. I think if the quality of your PCCP section is along those lines, I don't think FDA is looking to approve stuff that doesn't work. And because it's optional, they basically have no motivation or desire to put these out, approve these PCCPs if they aren't rigorous and kind of meet their expectations. So I don't want to make it sound like FDA is lowering their bar at all for review by including the PCCP as part of these processes.
Yeah, I know experts are talking about leveraging PCCPs also for hardware devices, like really considering that and approaching the FDA. And this is like the tool that will gonna get used more and more in next years. But as you said, it should be discussed with FDA. So we have additional question. Alex, what do you think the prospect is of getting a continuous learning machine learning algorithm through PCCP that through a pre-market submission such as de novo?
Um, hypothetically, I would say that it's very possible. I mean, I can just speak for myself in the sense that I was part of a lot of these initial discussions for predetermined change control plan when I was at the agency and working with the digital health team. I definitely have to give credit to folks like Matthew Diamond and Bakul Patel in the early days of this. That was actually the primary driving reason why PCCP was developed in the first place, was basically to allow FDA to be ready for these essentially devices that learn in the wild. Perhaps there's devices like that that are under review by FDA right now. Um, and I think eventually we'll get there. But I think one of the things to understand about that process, more from a probability perspective, when something comes to the FDA that they've not seen before, and they're being very careful about something like that being approved as part of a regulatory submission. It's going to take a lot of work probably for the first couple of devices that intend to have a device that learns in the wild and makes potentially even modifications to itself based on the information that it's seeing as part of its general use. I don't know how far we are away from that happening, but I do tend to agree with the idea that this is what PCCP was originally conceived for. And even though that's not necessarily what it's been used for mostly at this point, I do think that that is a possibility. But again, it really depends on convincing FDA that the changes that you want to make, as well as the processes and procedures that would be implemented to make sure that such a device would stay on the rails. Clearly, they'd have to be accepted and approved by FDA before that was allowed. But I do think the mechanism allows for it.
Thank you, Alex. And we have additional question. I think those are two questions. So I will start with the first one. Have you seen any FDA expectation in submissions that's in line with the select update guidance for cybersecurity?
I'd say for your question there, like cybersecurity has basically been the biggest obstacle, not only for most companies submitting their devices now. So if you recall, and I'm not great at quoting individual laws, but there have been authorities given to FDA that basically allow them to not review your device if you're not providing cybersecurity. The guidance went final that you're speaking about there. FDA's oversight of this space is extremely high at this point. A lot of times with the agency, things kind of go on a pendulum in terms of their regular oversight of things. I just want to make the point that that guidance, as well as some of these recent laws, the E-Star template changes that basically don't allow you to submit your device unless you've considered cybersecurity appropriately, we're kind of on the upswing still. We still have not reached the maximum oversight from FDA on cybersecurity. As I've heard from other folks at FDA in recent conversations, and parts of presentations at conferences, FDA doesn't think things are doing very well, and the oversight's just going to get higher and higher in the coming years. So I don't know if that exactly answers everything in your question, but I think that's kind of the main thing to be aware of, is that there's really no way around addressing cybersecurity for your devices in the United States.
Yeah, that's what we have encountered also with our experience in GSAP. We also have seen that cybersecurity is a major issue that's coming, and have additional questions from FDA for each pre-sub or submission that we're doing. So yeah, that's a major issue. How have you seen a PCCP implemented for a PMA device, meaning annual reportable when the change is implemented?
That is a question that a lot of times is a little complex for PCCP. I think a lot of times for PMA, and they are kind of rare for PMAs, at least, in terms of clients that I've interacted with. But I think the general idea there would be that, the changes that you're making, you'd be reporting them, of course, as part of the changes. It would be very similar to changes that you made that don't necessarily need FDA oversight, kind of from the modifications perspective. Um, and once those are predetermined, it basically would mean that you have a lot less burden in demonstrating the safety and effectiveness of those changes. So it may reduce kind of the expectation, and instead of requiring a supplement to your PMA, you may be able basically to provide it in your reporting for other changes that other general changes that you may be making that don't require for you to come in for a supplement. So that would be kind of the general benefit there. However, I think most of the time, just in general across these types of submission, the benefit is a little bit greater for the 510(k) space.
I see. Thank you, Alex. I think we have additional 2 questions, and then we'll wrap it up. So the following 2 questions are more general, I think. How should we refer to digital health regulatory changes for a product that is already cleared and now requires a new submission? For example, the technology formerly known as PACS, Picture Archiving and Communicating Systems, will now be referred as MPS. Assuming that one of the device functions fall under this change, how should we address this in the new submission if the clear device includes the term PACS?
So just to be clear on that question, I just want to correct something there in the sense that PACS is still actually a regulated medical device. The difference is that it's been down classified from class 2 to class 1. So what that essentially means is that if your medical device only includes PACS functions, there's no requirement for a 510(k) in the first place. Also, it means that with the new, I forget the meaning of the MIMPS acronym, but basically the idea that
medical image management and processing systems.
Right. So generally, the idea there for MIMPS is that you're talking about the signal processing aspects of your device. I just want to be clear here that oftentimes the platform that would be your PACS, it may make sense to include that as part of your submission. That's not going to be the focus of FDA's oversight of that MIMPS device. You could have submitted your MIMPS device without the PACS functionality being there. You could actually reference it as something that you've already put on the market as, say, a class 1. And I realize it's not always reasonable to have to separate these pieces out. But I just want to be clear here that there's really no necessity that those functions are included as part of your class 2 submission. So, also when it comes to changes to your device and even things for PCCP, if it's doesn't even require a 510(k) for PACS functionality, it doesn't even fall under something that would require a 510(k), so you wouldn't need to update a 510(k) for changes made to PACS functionality. And generally speaking, for things like cybersecurity, FDA doesn't want you to wait for their approval. They want you to make your device cyber secure. So I know I'm kind of covering a wide range of things there, but generally speaking, it's those signal processing applications that are the focus of FDA's oversight, a little bit less than functionality like PACS that they well understood that only requires you to register and list these days.
Thank you, Alex. And the last question we will cover is, how do FDA regulations for digital health devices align with international standards and regulations?
So I think with the new software guidance, it used to be, I would say, or kind of more of these international standards. FDA has versions of those standards that they recognize for very specific things. But there still is a difference in the expectation of what you're going to be providing to FDA. FDA has their own software guidance. I'm very happy that the new software guidance is better aligned with those international standards, but it's not a perfect match. And they did go as far as to say that if you're following, I believe, a certain version of 62304, you can provide that instead of providing your basically software development environment description. You can just claim adherence to that, but I want to be clear, it's a very specific version of that. It's not necessarily everything that's out there. You know, personally, my hope is that FDA does align with those international standards eventually, but clearly that's still not the case. FDA has their own way of looking at things and things that they want to see in their submissions. So, you know, if you are developing a device, for example, in the EU or Israel, and you're following those standards, and you do have an intent to eventually try to distribute that device in the United States and get pre-market clearance or approval, you will need to make sure that you are addressing those differences.
Thank you very much, Alex. We have no further questions for now. It was very, very interesting to hear all the insights. We are really going to ask more questions, I think. Thank you very much. Thank you for all the participants. As I mentioned, the recording and the slides will be on their way to you within a few days. If you have additional questions, if you want to contact us, you will have the contact information in the slides. Thank you very much. Thank you, Alex.
Thanks. It was a pleasure.
Bye. Thank you. Bye-bye.
אוקיי, רגע, end meeting, רגע.